Hello, fellow sapiens, and welcome back to Sleepless Homo. Take a moment to breathe, quiet your mind, and let this slow storytelling keep you company. Whether you're winding down for sleep, working late with headphones on, or simply finding calm in the rush of daily life, if you appreciate thoughtful, long-form science told with care and humility, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps more curious minds discover content that chooses knowledge over noise, understanding over spectacle. I'd love to know how these stories fit into your life. Are you listening before bed, while studying, maybe cooking dinner, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? Share it if you'd like. This channel grows through sapiens like you who value depth over speed, who prefer to wander through time rather than rush through it. And if you drift off during tonight's story, don't worry. I've placed timestamps in the description so you can return tomorrow and pick up exactly where you left off. Because this story, about a moment when our species nearly vanished, is worth hearing all the way through. This is soft science, not wild speculation. A humble attempt to trace what the evidence really shows while admitting how much remains uncertain. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Tonight's story begins 74,000 years ago, when the Earth shuddered and nearly ended the human story before it had properly begun. Picture this moment. You are among the last few thousand humans clinging to survival in scattered camps across Africa. The sky has been strange for months now, tinted with hues that have no name, and the air carries a metallic taste that settles on your tongue like the memory of lightning. Animals behave oddly, migrating in patterns that make no sense, fleeing from something your ancestors never taught you to recognize. Then, without warning, the northern horizon erupts. From your vantage point, thousands of kilometers away, you cannot see the mountain that is tearing itself apart. You cannot witness the moment when Lake Toba, nestled in what we now call Sumatra, becomes the throat of a geological monster. But you can see what follows. A column of ash and gas rises into the sky like a pillar holding up the heavens, growing wider and darker until it blots out the sun itself. This is the Toba supervolcano, and it is about to reshape not just the planet, but the very future of human existence. What you're witnessing is not simply an eruption. It is one of the most catastrophic events in the history of life on Earth. The explosion releases energy equivalent to several million nuclear weapons, detonating simultaneously. It hurls 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and debris into the atmosphere. That's enough material to bury the entire state of California under 3 meters of volcanic waste. But the immediate destruction is only the beginning of the story. The ash column climbs higher than commercial aircraft fly today, punching through the stratosphere and injecting sulfur compounds into the upper atmosphere, where they will linger for years. These microscopic particles begin to form a veil around the entire planet, reflecting sunlight back into space before it can reach the ground. Within weeks, global temperatures start to plummet. This is not a gradual cooling. This is a volcanic winter that descends like a curtain across the world. Imagine the confusion of those early humans as the familiar rhythms of their world begin to break down. The rains fail to come when expected. Rivers that have flowed for countless generations begin to dry up. Plants that have provided food for millennia wither and die as temperatures drop by as much as 15 degrees Celsius in some regions. The very foundation of survival, the predictable patterns of nature, crumbles beneath their feet. Archaeological evidence suggests that human populations, already small and scattered, contracted even further during this period. Genetic studies of modern humans reveal what scientists call a population bottleneck, a dramatic reduction in the number of breeding individuals that left its mark in our DNA forever. Some estimates suggest that the effective population of our species may have shrunk to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 individuals worldwide. To put that in perspective, imagine every human being on Earth today could trace their ancestry back to the population of a single small town. That town, scattered across Africa in tiny bands of survivors, held the entire future of our species in their hands. The evidence for this near-extinction event comes from multiple sources, each telling the same haunting story. Ice cores drilled from glaciers preserve the chemical signature of Toba's eruption, showing elevated levels of volcanic sulfur that spike dramatically at exactly the right time period. Deep sea sediment cores reveal layers of volcanic ash that can be traced directly back to Toba, spread across vast areas of the Indian Ocean. But perhaps most compelling is the genetic evidence locked within our own cells. When geneticists examine the DNA of people living today, they find something remarkable and troubling. Compared to other large mammals, humans show extraordinarily low genetic diversity. We are, in genetic terms, an unusually uniform species. This uniformity is exactly what you would expect if our ancestors had passed through an extremely narrow bottleneck, a genetic funnel that drastically reduced variation and left its signature in every human genome. The timing of this bottleneck aligns precisely with the Toba eruption. Of course, not all scientists agree on the severity of Toba's impact on human populations. Some argue that the genetic bottleneck occurred earlier, or that human populations were more resilient than the most dramatic scenarios suggest. Others point to archaeological sites that show continuous human occupation through the period of Toba's eruption, suggesting that while the volcano certainly caused hardship, it may not have brought us to the very brink of extinction. This uncertainty is part of what makes the story so compelling. We are dealing with evidence from 74,000 years ago, preserved in ice, stone, and the subtle variations of our genetic code. The picture we can construct is necessarily incomplete, painted in broad strokes with details that remain forever hidden. What we can say with confidence is that Toba represents one of the most significant volcanic events in human history, occurring at a crucial moment in our species' development. This was not the modern, globally connected human population of today. These were small bands of hunter-gatherers, completely dependent on local resources, with no knowledge of agriculture, no permanent settlements, no technology beyond stone tools and fire. When Toba erupted, these groups would have faced challenges unlike anything in their collective memory. The volcanic winter would have disrupted the seasonal patterns they depended on for survival. Food sources would have become scarce or disappeared entirely. Water sources might have been contaminated with ash. The very air could have become difficult to breathe as fine particles settled across the landscape. Some groups would have perished entirely, their lineages ending as the environmental pressures overwhelmed their ability to adapt. Others would have migrated desperately, seeking refuges where life could continue. Still others might have found ways to survive in place, developing new strategies for extracting resources from a transformed world. The survivors, wherever they were, however they managed to endure, carried within them the genetic heritage of our entire species. Every human alive today is descended from those who weathered this catastrophic storm. But Toba's story is not just about survival. It's about the profound ways that catastrophe can shape the trajectory of life itself. The population bottleneck that followed the eruption may have had unexpected consequences for human evolution and expansion. Some scientists propose that the environmental pressures created by Toba's volcanic winter may have accelerated the development of new technologies and social behaviors that would later prove crucial for human success. In the face of unprecedented challenges, our ancestors may have been forced to become more innovative, more cooperative, more adaptable. The small surviving populations might have developed tighter social bonds, more sophisticated communication, or new ways of exploiting marginal environments. These adaptations, forged in the crucible of near-extinction, could have given the survivors advantages that would serve them well in the millennia to come. There's also the possibility that Toba's eruption played a role in human migration patterns. As traditional habitats became uninhabitable, surviving groups might have been pushed into new territories, setting the stage for the later expansion of humans out of Africa and across the globe. The very catastrophe that nearly ended our story might have helped write the next chapter. The layers of ash from Toba, preserved in sediments across South and Southeast Asia, tell us that the eruption's effects were felt far beyond Sumatra. The volcanic debris traveled thousands of kilometers, carried by winds, and deposited across vast areas. In some locations, the ash layer is several meters thick, a testament to the sheer volume of material ejected from the Earth's crust. This ash would have had immediate and devastating effects on local ecosystems. Plants would have been buried, water sources contaminated, and air quality severely compromised. For any human populations living in these regions, the eruption would have been an immediate existential threat. Yet even as we trace the immediate devastation, the deeper story of Toba lies in time itself, in the slow unfolding of consequences that stretched across millennia. The volcanic winter that followed the eruption was not measured in days or weeks, but in years. Some climate models suggest that global temperatures remained depressed for up to 6 years after the initial blast, with regional effects persisting even longer. Imagine living through such an extended crisis. For people whose survival depended on intimate knowledge of seasonal rhythms, of when fruits ripened and when animals migrated, such prolonged disruption would have been incomprehensible. The natural world, once predictable enough to base life upon, had become alien and hostile. In the archaeological record, we find hints of how humans responded to this transformed world. Tool assemblages from sites dating to this period sometimes show increased sophistication, as if necessity had driven innovation. Stone points become more carefully crafted, hafting techniques more refined. There are suggestions that people began exploiting new food sources, turning to marine resources, underground storage organs of plants, or previously ignored animal species. These adaptations speak to something profound about human nature. When faced with unprecedented challenges, our ancestors did not simply endure passively. They experimented, they innovated, they found new ways to extract life from a world that seemed determined to extinguish it. The genetic legacy of Toba extends far beyond simple population numbers. When a species passes through such a narrow bottleneck, it loses not just individuals, but genetic variation itself. Rare alleles, the genetic variants that exist in only a few individuals, are the first to vanish. Entire lineages of mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down through maternal lines, simply disappear from the human gene pool forever. This loss of diversity had consequences that ripple through to the present day. Modern humans carry the scars of Toba in their susceptibility to certain diseases, in the limited range of immune system variants, in the relatively narrow spectrum of physical and physiological traits compared to what we see in other large mammals. We are, in a very real sense, the children of catastrophe, shaped by forces our ancestors could neither understand nor control. But there is something almost miraculous about the specific nature of our survival. The groups that made it through Toba's volcanic winter were not randomly selected. They were the ones who happened to be in the right places at the right time, who possessed the right combination of skills, knowledge, and perhaps most importantly, social cohesion to weather the storm. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of these refugees may have been along coastlines where marine resources could provide sustenance when terrestrial food webs collapsed. Shell middens, the ancient refuse heaps of coastal peoples, sometimes show continuous occupation through periods when inland sites go silent. The ocean, it seems, offered a buffer against the worst of Toba's effects. Other survivors may have found refuge in highland regions, where cooler temperatures were less of a shock and where certain plants and animals might have persisted even as lowland ecosystems collapsed. Still others might have endured in forest refuges, pockets of vegetation that somehow maintained themselves through the volcanic winter. These scattered sanctuaries, separated by vast distances and harsh conditions, became islands of human continuity in a world otherwise swept clean. The people who sheltered in these places would have had little or no contact with other surviving groups. They would have developed in isolation, their languages and customs, and even physical characteristics slowly diverging as generations passed. Yet somehow, they all endured. Somehow, in each of these isolated refuges, the flame of human consciousness continued to burn. Children were born, knowledge was passed down, stories were told around fires that pushed back against a darkness that seemed to have swallowed the world. The question that haunts this story is how close we actually came to extinction. The genetic evidence suggests the bottleneck was severe, but genetics can only tell us so much about lived experience. A population of 10,000 people sounds small in abstract terms, but scattered across a continent, organized into functional social groups, it might have been sufficient to maintain cultural continuity. On the other hand, environmental modeling of Toba's effects suggests conditions so harsh that even larger populations might have struggled to survive. The combination of temperature drops, acid rain, ashfall, and ecosystem collapse could have created a world where human life became almost impossible to sustain. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between these extremes. Perhaps our ancestors came closer to extinction than we can comfortably imagine, but not so close that survival required miraculous intervention. Perhaps they were simply tough enough, clever enough, and lucky enough to squeeze through a window of possibility that was narrower than any our species has faced before or since. The story of Toba also forces us to confront the role of chance in human history. If the eruption had been slightly larger, if the volcanic winter had lasted a few years longer, if the surviving populations had been just a little smaller or less well prepared, the story of humanity might have ended 74,000 years ago. There would be no cities, no art, no science, no love stories, no children playing in sunlit gardens. The Earth would be a planet of other intelligences, or perhaps no intelligence at all. Instead, we exist. We are here because a handful of our ancestors refused to surrender to the darkness. They endured cold and hunger and ash-filled skies. They watched their world transform into something unrecognizable and somehow found ways to make it home again. They carried forward the spark of human consciousness through one of the darkest chapters in our species' history. In the sediment cores that preserve Toba's ash, scientists can read the story of recovery as well as catastrophe. Above the dramatic spike in volcanic debris, the layers gradually return to normal. Temperatures stabilized. Ecosystems began to rebuild themselves. Life, as it always does, found a way to continue. But the human story emerging from Toba's shadow was different from what came before. The survivors carried with them not just genes, but experience. They had learned what it meant to live on the edge of extinction. They had developed new technologies, new social structures, new ways of thinking about survival in an unpredictable world. Some researchers suggest that this crucible experience may have contributed to the cognitive and cultural developments that would later characterize modern human behavior. The challenges of surviving Toba's aftermath might have selected for traits like enhanced cooperation, improved long-term planning, or greater behavioral flexibility. In this view, the catastrophe that nearly ended our story also helped write the next chapter. The humans who emerged from Toba's volcanic winter were not the same as those who had entered it. They were fewer in number, but perhaps more capable. They carried scars, but also wisdom earned in the hardest possible school. As these transformed survivors began to rebuild their shattered world, they faced challenges that would test every adaptation forged in the volcanic crucible. The Earth they inherited was not the same planet their grandparents had known. Ecosystems had been reshuffled, familiar species had vanished, and new ecological relationships were still forming in the aftermath of global disruption. The ash that had once darkened skies now lay embedded in soils across continents, creating new chemical environments that plants and animals had to navigate. Some species had gone extinct entirely, their ecological niches left vacant. Others had survived but in greatly reduced numbers, creating opportunities for rapid evolutionary change. The survivors of Toba inherited a world in flux, where the old rules of survival no longer applied. Archaeological sites from this period reveal fascinating glimpses of human adaptation to these transformed landscapes. Tool technologies show subtle but significant changes, as if the survivors were experimenting with new approaches to extracting resources from altered environments. Stone blade production becomes more systematic in some regions, suggesting innovations in efficiency that might have been crucial when materials were scarce. More intriguingly, there are hints of expanded dietary breadth. Sites show evidence of humans exploiting food sources that had been largely ignored before the eruption. Small game, marine mollusks, underground plant storage organs, even insects appear in archaeological assemblages with new frequency. This dietary flexibility may have been the difference between survival and extinction for many groups. But perhaps the most profound changes were invisible, written not in stone tools or food remains, but in the social fabric of human communities. Small populations, facing existential threats, develop different relationships with knowledge, cooperation, and risk. When every individual's survival matters for the continuity of the group, social structures necessarily become more egalitarian, more inclusive of different skills and perspectives. The genetic bottleneck that followed Toba had another, more subtle consequence. With so few breeding individuals, every successful reproductive partnership mattered enormously. This may have led to new social arrangements, new ways of organizing kinship and alliance that maximized genetic diversity within severely constrained populations. The survivors could not afford the luxury of excluding potential partners based on minor differences in custom or appearance. Linguistic evidence, though necessarily speculative at such temporal distances, suggests that this period may have been crucial for the development of modern human language. When small, isolated groups must coordinate complex survival strategies, communicate detailed knowledge about changing environments, and maintain social cohesion across extended hardships, the selective pressure for sophisticated communication becomes intense. The scattered refuges where humans weathered Toba's winter were not just geographical locations, but crucibles of cultural innovation. Cut off from other groups, each surviving community had to become completely self-reliant. They could not trade for materials they lacked, could not call on neighboring groups for assistance, could not rely on the accumulated knowledge of a broader network. Everything they needed to survive, they had to create, maintain, and transmit themselves. This isolation forced a kind of cultural compression. Essential knowledge had to be preserved and transmitted with perfect fidelity because there were no backup copies, no alternative sources if information was lost. At the same time, rapid innovation was required to adapt to changing conditions. The balance between conservation and innovation, between preserving crucial traditions and developing new solutions, may have shaped human culture in ways we are only beginning to understand. Climate records from ice cores show that the recovery from Toba's volcanic winter was not smooth or linear. There were false starts, periods when temperatures began to rise, only to plummet again. Rainfall patterns remained chaotic for decades. The survivors had to navigate not just the immediate crisis, but an extended period of climatic instability that tested their adaptive capacity again and again. During these uncertain centuries, human populations began the slow process of demographic recovery. But this was not simply a return to pre-eruption numbers. The groups that had survived were genetically and culturally different from their ancestors. As they expanded from their refuges, they carried with them new technologies, new social structures, new ways of understanding and relating to the natural world. The recolonization of landscapes devastated by Toba would have been a gradual, careful process. Scouting parties might have ventured out from established refuges, testing whether particular areas could support human life again. They would have encountered environments that were simultaneously familiar and alien, where known landmarks might remain, but the biological communities had been thoroughly reshuffled. Some researchers propose that this period of recolonization may have contributed to the development of the sophisticated spatial cognition and navigation abilities that characterize modern humans. When familiar territories have been transformed beyond recognition, survival depends on the ability to quickly map new relationships between resources, hazards, and seasonal patterns. The cognitive demands of navigating a post-catastrophe world may have selected for enhanced spatial intelligence. The recovery was not uniform across the globe. Regions closer to Toba itself remained uninhabitable for extended periods, while areas that had experienced less severe impacts began showing signs of human reoccupation relatively quickly. This uneven recovery created new patterns of human distribution, new corridors of movement, new barriers to migration that would influence human history for millennia to come. In Africa, where the largest populations of survivors likely persisted, the post-Toba period saw what may have been the first stirrings of the technological and cultural developments that would later characterize the Middle Stone Age. Blade technologies become more sophisticated, symbolic artifacts appear with greater frequency, and there are hints of long-distance trade networks beginning to re-establish themselves. But the memory of Toba lived on in ways both obvious and subtle. The reduced genetic diversity of post-bottleneck populations meant that humans were more susceptible to certain diseases, more uniform in their physiological responses to environmental challenges. At the same time, the cultural innovations developed during the crisis provided tools and strategies that would prove invaluable in later expansions into new environments. The story preserved in our genes tells of populations that remained small for thousands of years after Toba, growing slowly and cautiously, as if some collective memory warned against expanding too quickly, too carelessly. The survivors had learned hard lessons about the fragility of existence, about how quickly a thriving population could be reduced to scattered refugees clinging to survival in marginal refuges. Yet there was also resilience encoded in this genetic legacy. The populations that survived Toba had proven their adaptability under the most extreme conditions imaginable. They carried within them the genetic and cultural heritage of humans who had refused to surrender to extinction. This heritage of survival against impossible odds may have provided the foundation for humanity's later expansion across the globe. Archaeological evidence suggests that the post-Toba period was characterized by increased mobility. Perhaps the survivors had learned not to become too dependent on any single location, any particular set of resources. Tool assemblages show greater standardization across regions, as if cultural innovations were spreading more rapidly than before, carried by populations that moved frequently and maintained connections across vast distances. The volcanic winter had taught harsh lessons about environmental unpredictability, about the danger of becoming too specialized, too dependent on particular ecological niches. The humans who emerged from this experience may have been more behaviorally flexible, more willing to experiment with new subsistence strategies, more capable of rapid cultural adaptation to changing circumstances. In the sedimentary record, the layers above Toba's ash signature tell a story of gradual but persistent recovery. pollen counts show ecosystems slowly rebuilding themselves, though often in configurations different from what existed before. Species that had survived in small refuges began to expand their ranges again, recolonizing territories where they had been locally extinct. Humans were part of this broader pattern of post-catastrophe recovery, but their story was unique in its conscious, intentional character. While other species simply responded to improving conditions with population growth and range expansion, humans carried forward the lessons learned in the crucible of near-extinction. They were not just recovering, they were applying hard-won wisdom about survival in an unpredictable world. The social structures that emerged from Toba's shadow may have been fundamentally different from those that existed before. When survival depends on the cooperation of every individual, when knowledge cannot be lost without potentially fatal consequences, when every successful reproduction matters for the continuity of the group, hierarchies flatten and inclusive decision-making becomes essential. Some anthropologists suggest that this period may have seen the development of the egalitarian social structures that characterize many modern hunter-gatherer societies. The extreme selective pressure for cooperation and knowledge sharing may have eliminated social arrangements that excluded individuals from full participation in group survival strategies. But the story of human recovery from Toba is not just about survival and adaptation. It is also about loss, about the paths not taken, the innovations that died with extinct populations, the cultural diversity that was permanently erased. Each group that perished in the volcanic winter took with them unique ways of understanding the world, unique solutions to the problems of human existence. The survivors inherited not just a transformed planet, but also the responsibility of carrying forward the entire human experiment. They were the sole custodians of consciousness in a cosmos that had briefly threatened to extinguish it entirely. This may have imbued their cultures with a particular intensity, a recognition of the preciousness and fragility of the flame they carried. As temperatures gradually stabilized and ecosystems began to recover, the scattered communities of survivors faced new challenges. How to maintain the cultural innovations that had enabled their survival while adapting to improving conditions. How to preserve the cooperative social structures forged in crisis while allowing for population growth and territorial expansion. How to pass on the lessons of catastrophe to generations who would grow up in a more stable world. The answers to these questions would shape the trajectory of human development for tens of thousands of years to come. The humans who walked out of Toba's shadow were not the same species that had entered it. They carried within them the seeds of everything we would become, tempered by forces we can barely imagine, and strengthened by trials that tested the very limits of human endurance. The recovery from Toba was not just ecological or demographic, it was profoundly cognitive. When you strip away everything familiar, when the very rhythms of the natural world no longer follow their ancient patterns, consciousness itself must adapt or perish. The survivors carried within their minds maps of a world that no longer existed, knowledge systems calibrated to environments that had been fundamentally altered. Consider what this meant for human memory and learning. For countless generations, survival had depended on accumulated wisdom about seasonal patterns, about when certain plants flowered, when animals migrated, where water could be found during dry periods. This knowledge was not written down. It lived in human minds, passed from elder to child through story and demonstration, refined through generations of careful observation. Toba shattered these knowledge systems overnight. The seasonal patterns that had guided human life for millennia became unreliable. Plants that had fruited predictably for thousands of years failed to reproduce. Animal migration routes that had remained stable across countless generations suddenly shifted or disappeared entirely. The survivors found themselves possessing encyclopedic knowledge of a world that no longer existed, yet they adapted. Archaeological evidence suggests that the post-Toba period saw an acceleration in certain types of innovation. Tool technologies that had remained relatively stable for tens of thousands of years began evolving more rapidly. New types of projectile points appear in the archaeological record, often with more sophisticated hafting arrangements that suggest improved understanding of leverage and impact dynamics. More significantly, there are hints of what archaeologists call behavioral modernity beginning to crystallize during this period. Symbolic artifacts become more common. Evidence of long-distance trade networks, though still sparse, begins to appear with greater frequency. The scattered survivors seem to have developed new ways of encoding and transmitting information, perhaps driven by the recognition that knowledge could be lost forever if not properly preserved. The genetic legacy of Toba shaped not just our physical characteristics, but our cognitive architecture as well. Population bottlenecks can have unexpected effects on brain development and function. When a species passes through such a narrow genetic filter, certain neural pathways may become more standardized, while others might be lost entirely. Some researchers propose that the cognitive uniformity we see in modern humans, our shared capacity for language, symbolic thought, and complex social cooperation may have been shaped by Toba's bottleneck. In a sense, the catastrophe may have acted as a filter, preserving only those cognitive variants that proved most adaptive under extreme environmental stress. This standardization of human cognition had profound implications. While it may have reduced certain types of cognitive diversity, it also enabled unprecedented levels of cultural transmission and cooperation. Humans emerging from the bottleneck could communicate and collaborate across group boundaries with an efficiency that may have been impossible when cognitive diversity was greater. The social implications of this cognitive convergence cannot be overstated. When different groups of survivors eventually reestablished contact after centuries or millennia of isolation, they discovered that despite their separation, they retained fundamental similarities in how they processed information, solved problems, and organized their social worlds. This shared cognitive foundation may have enabled the rapid cultural exchanges that characterized later human prehistory. But the path to recovery was neither straight nor certain. Climate records show that the millennium following Toba was marked by continued instability. Even after global temperatures began to recover, regional variations remained extreme. Some areas experienced extended droughts that lasted centuries, while others saw flooding patterns that made permanent settlement nearly impossible. These ongoing environmental challenges meant that human populations could not simply rebuild their pre-catastrophe lifestyles. They had to develop new forms of social organization adapted to a world of chronic uncertainty. Archaeological evidence suggests that post-Toba societies were characterized by greater mobility, more flexible social structures, and increased emphasis on maintaining connections across vast distances. The survivors developed what we might call a catastrophe mindset, a way of organizing society that assumed environmental stability could not be taken for granted. This manifested in technologies designed for portability, social structures that could function across dispersed populations, and knowledge systems that prioritized adaptability over specialization. One of the most intriguing aspects of the post-Toba recovery is how it may have shaped human relationship with risk. Populations that had barely survived complete extinction developed sophisticated strategies for managing uncertainty. They became masters of what anthropologists call risk pooling, creating social networks that could buffer individuals and families against local disasters. These networks operated across multiple scales. At the local level, bands developed sharing arrangements that ensured no individual went without resources when others had abundance. At regional levels, different groups established reciprocal relationships that provided insurance against localized resource failures. At continental scales, there may have been loose networks of trade and information exchange that helped communities respond to large-scale environmental changes. The development of these risk management strategies required new forms of social cognition. Humans had to become capable of maintaining relationships with people they might see only rarely, of tracking complex networks of obligation and reciprocity across time and space, of making decisions that balanced immediate needs against long-term stability. Archaeological sites from this period often show evidence of what researchers call curation behavior. Tools are maintained and repaired rather than discarded. Raw materials are conserved and recycled, and there is careful attention to minimizing waste. This suggests populations living with constant awareness of scarcity, of the need to extract maximum value from every available resource. Yet this was not mere survival. Even during the most difficult periods of recovery, human populations continued to invest energy in activities that had no immediate survival value. Artistic expression, though often simpler than in later periods, never disappeared entirely. Burial practices, though they may have become more standardized, continued to reflect beliefs about death and continuity that transcended immediate practical concerns. The persistence of these seemingly impractical activities speaks to something profound about human nature. Even at the edge of extinction, even when every calorie mattered for survival, our ancestors continued to seek meaning, to create beauty, to express their understanding of their place in the cosmos. The catastrophe had not extinguished the human drive toward transcendence. In the realm of technology, the post-Toba period saw the development of what archaeologists call expedient technologies. These were tool systems designed to be quickly manufactured from locally available materials, used for immediate tasks, and then discarded without significant investment of time or energy. This represented a fundamental shift from earlier traditions that emphasized carefully crafted, long-lasting implements. This technological shift reflected deeper changes in human mobility and resource use. Populations that moved frequently could not afford to carry elaborate toolkits or invest heavily in equipment that might need to be abandoned. Instead, They developed the cognitive and motor skills necessary to rapidly create effective tools from whatever materials were at hand. But expedient technology was not inferior technology. The ability to quickly assess local materials, design appropriate tools, and manufacture effective implements on demand actually required more sophisticated understanding of physics, materials science, and engineering than simply maintaining traditional tool forms. The survivors of Toba became technological generalists of extraordinary capability. Language itself may have undergone fundamental changes during this period. When populations are small and scattered, when survival depends on precise communication about complex environmental conditions and social arrangements, linguistic efficiency becomes paramount. Some linguists propose that the grammatical structures that characterize all modern human languages may have crystallized during the post-Toba recovery. The pressure to communicate effectively across group boundaries, to transmit crucial survival information with perfect accuracy, to maintain social cohesion among dispersed populations, may have selected for linguistic features that maximized clarity and minimized ambiguity. The result could have been a convergence on grammatical structures that proved most effective for these critical communication tasks. This linguistic convergence may explain one of the most puzzling features of human language diversity. Despite tens of thousands of years of separation and independent development, all human languages share certain deep structural similarities. These universal grammatical features may be the legacy of a period when linguistic efficiency was quite literally a matter of life and death. The demographic recovery from Toba was painfully slow. Genetic evidence suggests that human populations remained small for millennia after the initial catastrophe. Growth rates were constrained not just by environmental limitations, but by the social and cultural adaptations that had enabled survival during the crisis. Populations that had learned to function effectively in small groups may have faced challenges when attempting to scale up their social organizations. The egalitarian structures that worked well for bands of 30 or 40 individuals might have become unwieldy when groups grew larger. The consensus-based decision-making that ensured everyone's survival during the catastrophe might have become inefficient when applied to larger, more diverse populations. Archaeological evidence suggests that post-Toba societies experimented with various forms of social organization as populations slowly grew. Some groups maintained the small band structure that had proven successful during the crisis, periodically splitting when they reached certain size thresholds. Others developed more complex hierarchical arrangements that allowed for larger group sizes while maintaining social cohesion. These experiments in social organization were not merely academic exercises. They were matters of survival in a world where environmental conditions remained unpredictable and where the margin between success and failure remained razor thin. The social structures that emerged from this period of experimentation would provide the foundation for all later human societies. The recovery was also marked by what archaeologists call demographic pulsing. Rather than growing steadily, populations seem to have expanded in waves, with periods of growth followed by contractions. This pattern may reflect the ongoing environmental instability of the post-Toba world, where favorable conditions could support population growth for several generations before deteriorating conditions forced demographic retreat. These cycles of expansion and contraction created opportunities for cultural innovation and exchange. During expansion phases, growing populations encountered new environments and developed new technologies for exploiting them. During contraction phases, different groups might be forced into closer contact, leading to cultural hybridization and the spread of innovations across previously isolated populations. The psychological legacy of Toba may have been as significant as its genetic and cultural impacts. Populations that had experienced near extinction developed what we might call a survival psychology, a set of cognitive and emotional responses adapted to life under extreme uncertainty. This psychology emphasized vigilance, flexibility, and cooperation while maintaining deep skepticism about environmental stability. Evidence for this survival psychology can be found in the mythologies and belief systems that emerge in later human cultures. Many of the world's oldest stories speak of great catastrophes, of floods and fires that nearly destroyed the world, of small groups of survivors who carried life forward through periods of darkness and chaos. Thus, stories may preserve cultural memories of the Toba catastrophe and its aftermath. The survivors of Toba bequeathed to their descendants not just genes and technologies, but ways of thinking about existence itself. They understood, in ways that we struggle to comprehend, that life is fragile, that comfort and security are temporary, that survival depends ultimately on adaptability rather than strength. These lessons, encoded in culture and consciousness, shaped human development long after the volcanic ash had settled and the world had begun to heal. As centuries passed and conditions gradually improved, the direct memory of Toba began to fade. New generations grew up in a more stable world, where the seasonal patterns were more predictable, where food was more abundant, where survival no longer demanded constant vigilance and innovation. Yet the adaptations forged in that crucible of near extinction remained, embedded in human genetics, culture, and consciousness. The humans who eventually began expanding beyond Africa, who would colonize every continent and develop the technologies and social systems that characterize our modern world, carried within them the legacy of those who had survived the unthinkable. They were the inheritors of a hard-won wisdom about survival, adaptation, and resilience that would serve them well as they encountered new environments and new challenges. But they were also the bearers of a profound awareness of fragility, of the recognition that even the most successful species, even the most sophisticated societies, exist always at the mercy of forces beyond their control. The shadow of Toba stretched far into the future, shaping not just what humans became, but how they understood their place in a cosmos that could be both nurturing and utterly destructive. The story of Toba reminds us that our existence is not guaranteed, that the line between thriving and extinction can be crossed in moments that are geological blinks of an eye. We are here not because we were destined to be, but because a small number of our ancestors proved capable of enduring conditions that tested the very limits of what life can bear. Their survival was our inheritance, their resilience our foundation, their hard-won wisdom our birthright. In the quiet hours when we contemplate our place in deep time, when we consider the vast sweep of cosmic history and our small but significant role within it, the story of Toba offers both humility and hope. It reminds us that we are fragile, that our civilizations and technologies and accumulated knowledge rest on foundations that could be shaken by forces we cannot predict or control. But it also reminds us that fragility and resilience are not opposites, that the capacity to survive the unthinkable lies within the human spirit, waiting to be called upon when circumstances demand it. The survivors of Toba looked up at skies darkened by ash and refused to surrender. They watched their familiar world transform into something alien and found ways to make it home. They carried forward the spark of consciousness through one of the darkest chapters in the history of life on Earth. We exist because they endured, because they adapted, because they never stopped hoping that tomorrow might be better than today. The implications of Toba stretch beyond individual survival into the realm of human consciousness itself. When we examine the archaeological record from the millennia following the eruption, we find something remarkable: the emergence of what appears to be a fundamentally new relationship between humans and their environment. The survivors did not simply rebuild what had been lost. They created something unprecedented. In the caves of southern Africa, rock art begins to appear with greater frequency and sophistication in the period following Toba. These are not crude scratches or simple handprints, but complex compositions that suggest minds grappling with abstract concepts, with the need to encode meaning in permanent form. Some researchers propose that the near-extinction experience created an urgent imperative to preserve knowledge, to create external memory stores that could survive even if individuals or entire groups perished. The symbolic revolution that many archaeologists see as the hallmark of modern human behavior may have been catalyzed by catastrophe, when oral traditions could be wiped out by the death of a few knowledgeable elders, when entire communities could vanish in a single harsh season. The development of external symbolic systems became not just advantageous, but essential. The survivors of Toba may have been among the first humans to truly understand that knowledge itself could go extinct. This understanding transformed human culture in ways we are only beginning to appreciate. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of what researchers call symbolic storage systems. Geometric patterns carved into stone, arrangements of objects that seem to encode information, even the systematic use of ochre pigments in ways that suggest standardized color coding. These were the first tentative steps toward the external storage of information that would eventually culminate in writing, mathematics, and science. But the changes went deeper than technology or even symbolic expression. The genetic bottleneck that followed Toba created what evolutionary biologists call founder effects, not just in our DNA, but in our behavior patterns. When small populations must cooperate intensively to survive, certain social behaviors become so strongly selected for that they become essentially hardwired into the species. Modern humans display levels of cooperation and altruism that are unprecedented in the animal kingdom. We help strangers. We sacrifice for abstract ideals. We coordinate complex activities across vast numbers of individuals with whom we have no direct relationship. Some researchers suggest that these extraordinary capacities for cooperation were forged in the crucible of post-Toba survival, when the failure to work together meant the extinction of the entire human lineage. The small populations that survived Toba could not afford free riders, individuals who took advantage of group resources without contributing. They could not tolerate excessive competition within groups when cooperation was essential for survival against an environment that had become actively hostile. The result may have been intense selection for what psychologists call prosocial behaviors, the tendency to act in ways that benefit the group even at personal cost. This selection for cooperation had profound implications for human cognitive development. Brains that had evolved primarily to navigate the physical world and manage individual survival suddenly had to become sophisticated social computers, capable of tracking complex networks of reciprocity, obligation, and shared intention. The cognitive demands of post-catastrophe cooperation may have driven rapid evolution in regions of the brain associated with social cognition and language processing. Archaeological evidence for this cognitive revolution is necessarily indirect, but it appears in subtle changes in material culture. Tool assemblages from the post-Toba period show what researchers call standardization, the emergence of consistent forms and manufacturing techniques across wide geographical areas. This standardization suggests that humans were becoming capable of transmitting precise technical knowledge across groups and generations with unprecedented fidelity. More intriguingly, the standardization was not merely functional. Tools that served identical purposes often incorporated decorative elements or stylistic features that had no practical utility. This suggests that humans were developing what anthropologists call cultural marking, the use of material objects to signal group identity and maintain social boundaries. Even in the midst of demographic crisis, people were investing energy in creating and maintaining cultural distinctions. This tension between cooperation and differentiation would become a defining characteristic of human societies. The survivors of Toba needed to work together to survive, but they also needed to maintain the cultural diversity that provided resilience against future catastrophes. The result was a delicate balance between unity and variation, between shared humanity and distinct cultural identity. The environmental pressures that followed Toba also drove innovations in subsistence technology that would prove crucial for later human expansion. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of systematic fishing, sophisticated hunting techniques adapted to depleted game populations, and intensive exploitation of plant resources that had previously been ignored. These innovations require detailed ecological knowledge and complex planning abilities that may have stretched human cognitive capacities in new directions. Perhaps most significantly, the post-Toba period saw the development of what archaeologists call logistical mobility, the ability to coordinate resource extraction across multiple locations and timescales. Rather than simply following resources as they became available, humans began to anticipate seasonal patterns, to plan extraction strategies months in advance, to cache resources for future use. This represented a fundamental shift from reactive to proactive survival strategies. The development of logistical mobility required new forms of spatial cognition and temporal reasoning. Humans had to become capable of maintaining mental maps of resource availability across vast territories, of coordinating group activities across extended time periods, of making decisions about resource allocation based on probabilistic assessments of future conditions. These cognitive demands may have driven the evolution of the enhanced working memory and planning abilities that characterize modern human cognition. But the most profound change may have been in human relationship with uncertainty itself. Pre-Toba humans lived in a world where environmental patterns were relatively predictable, where survival strategies could be based on reliable seasonal cycles and stable resource distributions. The survivors of Toba inherited a world where uncertainty was the only certainty, where survival depended on the ability to thrive in the face of constant unpredictability. This transformation is visible in the archaeological record as what researchers call technological flexibility. Rather than developing increasingly specialized tools for specific tasks, post-Toba populations created versatile implement systems that could be rapidly adapted to changing circumstances. Stone blade technologies, for example, provided platforms that could be modified into dozens of different tool types depending on immediate needs and available materials. This technological flexibility reflected deeper changes in human psychology. The survivors had learned to embrace change rather than resist it, to see unpredictability as an opportunity for innovation rather than a threat to stability. They developed what modern psychologists might recognize as growth mindsets, the belief that abilities and strategies could be developed and modified in response to changing circumstances. The cultural implications of this psychological shift were enormous. Post-Toba human societies became laboratories of innovation, constantly experimenting with new social arrangements, new technologies, new ways of organizing knowledge, and transmitting it across generations. The static cultural patterns that had characterized earlier human societies gave way to dynamic systems that could rapidly adapt to new challenges. This cultural dynamism was not without costs. The constant experimentation and adaptation required enormous investments of energy and attention. Populations had to maintain multiple parallel systems, ready to switch between different strategies as circumstances demanded. The cognitive and social overhead of this flexibility may have limited population growth and territorial expansion for millennia after the initial catastrophe. Yet this investment in adaptability ultimately paid enormous dividends. When human populations eventually began expanding beyond Africa, they carried with them a toolkit of survival strategies that had been tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. They possessed cognitive abilities honed by generations of life at the edge of extinction, social structures that could function effectively under extreme stress, and technologies that could be rapidly adapted to new environments. The expansion of humans across the globe was not simply a demographic phenomenon. It was the culmination of a long process of adaptation that began in the volcanic winter that followed Toba's eruption. The cognitive abilities that enabled humans to navigate new continents, to adapt to radically different climates, to develop the technologies and social systems that would eventually support complex civilizations, were forged in the crucible of near-extinction. Archaeological evidence suggests that this expansion began tentatively, with small groups probing beyond their traditional territories, testing whether the strategies that had enabled survival in post-Toba Africa could work in new environments. Early sites outside Africa often show the same characteristics as post-Toba assemblages within the continent: technological flexibility, evidence of logistical planning, sophisticated resource extraction strategies adapted to local conditions. But the expansion was not merely a continuation of post-Toba survival strategies. It represented a fundamental transformation in human relationship with the planet itself. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, a single species was becoming capable of thriving in virtually any terrestrial environment, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests, from mountain highlands to coastal plains. This unprecedented ecological flexibility was the direct legacy of Toba's catastrophe. The survivors had learned to see every environment as potentially habitable, every resource as potentially useful, every challenge as potentially surmountable. They had developed what we might call a planetary perspective, the understanding that survival was not tied to any particular place or set of resources, but to the capacity for adaptation itself. The psychological and cultural foundations laid during the post-Toba recovery would eventually enable achievements that would have been inconceivable to pre-catastrophe human populations. The ability to coordinate activities across vast distances, to maintain cultural continuity while adapting to radically different environments, to transmit complex knowledge systems across generations and geographical barriers, all had their roots in the survival strategies developed in the aftermath of volcanic winter. Yet even as human populations spread across continents and developed increasingly complex technologies and social systems, they carried within them the memory of fragility. The mythologies and belief systems that emerged in different parts of the world often contained similar themes, stories of great catastrophes that nearly ended the world, of small groups of survivors who carried life forward through periods of darkness, of the constant possibility that comfort and security could vanish without warning. These cultural memories were not merely historical curiosities. They represented hard-won wisdom about the nature of existence itself, about the relationship between resilience and fragility, about the importance of maintaining the capacity for adaptation even in times of apparent stability. The survivors of Toba had learned lessons about survival that remained relevant long after the immediate crisis had passed. As human societies grew larger and more complex, as technologies developed that seemed to insulate populations from environmental uncertainty, the immediate relevance of post-Toba survival strategies became less obvious. Yet the underlying cognitive and cultural adaptations remained, embedded in human psychology and social organization, ready to be activated when circumstances demanded. The story of human recovery from Toba is ultimately a story about the relationship between catastrophe and creativity, between destruction and innovation. The volcanic winter that nearly ended human existence also created the conditions that enabled our species to transcend the limitations that had constrained earlier human populations. The survivors emerged from the catastrophe not just genetically, but culturally transformed, possessing capabilities that would eventually enable them to reshape the planet itself. In the deep layers of sediment that preserve the geological record of Toba's eruption, scientists can trace the slow transition from catastrophe to recovery. The dramatic spike of volcanic ash gives way to layers that tell of gradual environmental stabilization, of ecosystems slowly rebuilding themselves, of life finding new pathways forward. But the human story preserved in these layers is different from that of other species. It is a story of conscious adaptation, of deliberate innovation, of minds that could learn from catastrophe and use that learning to create something unprecedented. The ash that once darkened skies across the planet now lies buried beneath layers of time, its chemical signature detectable only to the most sophisticated analytical techniques. But its legacy lives on in every human mind, in the cognitive capabilities that enable us to imagine futures that do not yet exist, to coordinate activities across vast scales of space and time, to create technologies and social systems that transcend the limitations of individual experience. We are, in the most literal sense, the children of catastrophe. Our consciousness, our creativity, our capacity for cooperation and innovation all bear the imprint of ancestors who refused to surrender when the world seemed to be ending. They looked up at skies darkened by volcanic ash and chose to believe that dawn would come again. They faced the collapse of everything familiar and found within themselves the strength to build something new. The story of Toba reminds us that our most profound achievements as a species have emerged not from periods of comfort and stability, but from moments when survival itself was in question. It suggests that the capacity for transcendence, for rising above circumstances that seem insurmountable, is not an accident of human nature, but its very essence. We are who we are because our ancestors proved capable of enduring the unthinkable and transforming catastrophe into opportunity. In the quiet hours of the night, when we contemplate our place in the vast sweep of cosmic history, the story of Toba offers both sobering perspective and profound hope. It reminds us that our existence is contingent, that the achievements of civilization rest on foundations that could be shaken by forces beyond our control. But it also reminds us that within the human spirit lies a capacity for resilience that has been tested under the most extreme conditions and has not been found wanting. The survivors of Toba bequeath to us more than genes and technologies. They gave us the knowledge that survival is possible even when it seems impossible, that consciousness can persist even when the physical world seems determined to extinguish it, that the future can be different from the past even when the present offers little reason for hope. These gifts, forged in the crucible of near-extinction, remain our inheritance and our inspiration as we face the uncertainties of our own time. The sediment cores tell us that Toba's effects were not merely regional, but planetary in scope. Layers of volcanic glass, microscopic shards that traveled thousands of kilometers on high-altitude winds, have been found in ocean floor samples from the Arabian Sea to the South China Sea. These tiny fragments, each no larger than a grain of sand, are the scattered remnants of a mountain that exploded with such violence that pieces of it circled the globe. But it is in the ice cores of Greenland and Antarctica that we find perhaps the most haunting record of what followed. Trapped within ancient ice, preserved for millennia in frozen silence, are the chemical signatures of Toba's volcanic winter. The ice tells of sulfur compounds that lingered in the stratosphere for years, of atmospheric chemistry so altered that it took nearly a decade for normal patterns to resume. These are not abstract measurements. They represent real changes in the daily experience of our ancestors. Imagine waking each morning to skies that remained dim even at noon, to air that carried the acrid taste of sulfur, to temperatures that dropped week after week until hunting grounds became frozen wastelands and familiar plants simply stopped growing. The ice cores suggest that in some regions, Average temperatures may have fallen by as much as 16 degrees Celsius. For people whose survival depended on intimate knowledge of seasonal rhythms, such disruption would have been incomprehensible. The natural calendar that had governed human life for countless generations suddenly meant nothing. Rivers that should have swollen with spring rains remained frozen through what should have been summer months. Animals that should have migrated north never appeared. Seeds that should have sprouted in a warming soil lay dormant in earth that refused to thaw. The psychological impact of such disruption is difficult to imagine. These were not people with global communication networks or scientific understanding of atmospheric chemistry. They had no framework for comprehending what was happening, no way to predict when conditions might improve, no knowledge that similar events had occurred in the deep past and that recovery was possible. They faced each day in a world that seemed to be dying, with no assurance that tomorrow would be any better than today. Yet they endured. In the archaeological record, we find evidence of remarkable adaptability during this period. Stone tool assemblages show increased sophistication in hunting implements, as if people were being forced to pursue prey that had become scarce and wary. There are signs of expanded dietary breadth, with humans exploiting food sources that had previously been ignored. Shell middens along ancient coastlines suggest that some groups survived by turning to marine resources when terrestrial food webs collapsed. Perhaps most significantly, there are hints of what archaeologists call technological convergence during this period. Similar innovations appear simultaneously in widely separated regions, as if isolated groups were independently arriving at similar solutions to the challenges of survival in a transformed world. Blade technologies become more standardized. Hafting techniques show remarkable similarity across vast distances. It is as if necessity was driving human ingenuity along parallel paths. The genetic evidence for this period tells a story that is both stark and subtle. When population geneticists examine the DNA of people living today, they find signatures of what is called a serial founder effect. This is the pattern that emerges when small groups repeatedly split off from larger populations, carrying with them only a subset of the original genetic diversity. It is the signature of a species fragmenting under pressure, breaking apart into isolated remnants that survived in scattered refuges. But the genetic record also preserves evidence of something else: periodic reconnection. Even during the harshest periods of the volcanic winter, gene flow between distant populations never ceased entirely. Somehow, despite the chaos and environmental devastation, human groups maintained tenuous connections across vast distances. People traveled, groups merged, genetic lineages that had been separated for generations found ways to reunite. This maintenance of genetic connectivity during a period of extreme environmental stress speaks to something profound about human social nature. Even when survival demanded focusing entirely on immediate local needs, our ancestors found ways to maintain relationships across broader networks. They understood, perhaps intuitively, that isolation was a form of genetic death, that long-term survival required periodic mixing of bloodlines, even when such mixing involved enormous risks. The archaeological evidence for this connectivity is subtle but persistent. Raw materials that originated hundreds of kilometers from where they are found. Tool styles that show influence from distant traditions. Burial practices that suggest contact between groups that archaeological convention would consider separate cultures. These traces tell of a human world that remained connected even as it fragmented, that maintained social networks even as populations crashed. Some researchers have proposed that this period saw the development of what anthropologists call fictive kinship systems, social arrangements that created family-like bonds between individuals who were not genetically related. When actual families were so frequently broken by death and displacement, the ability to create new kinship networks with survivors from other groups would have been essential for psychological stability and social cohesion. The evidence for such arrangements is necessarily indirect, but it appears in the archaeological record as what researchers call inclusive burial practices. During this period, cemetery sites sometimes contain individuals with markedly different genetic backgrounds, as revealed by isotopic analysis of their bones. These people grew up in different regions, ate different foods, lived different lives, yet were buried together as if they belonged to the same community. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering through this story of survival and transformation with me. Tonight, we've traced the footsteps of our ancestors through ash-darkened skies and volcanic winter, witnessing how a single geological moment nearly erased our species from existence. Yet from that crucible of near extinction emerged the very qualities that define us today, our capacity for cooperation, innovation, and resilience. If this story helped you find some calm in the quiet hours, if it reminded you that existence itself is remarkable, then it has served its purpose. Like, subscribe, and share this with the curious sapiens in your life, who understand that our greatest strength lies not in our certainty, but in our to endure uncertainty itself. The survivors of Toba carried forward more than genes. They carried forward hope. And as always, stay curious, stay calm.